Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unlocking Fitness podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Pitts, and in today's episode, my guest is Jamie Taylor, who is Senior Coach Developer and Systems Advisor at greymattersuk.com. Jamie has spent his working life engrossed in the practice of coaching and developing people as a teacher and coach of grassroots sports and a rugby coach at a professional level before moving into coach development and mentoring. His work has led him to experience a variety of different sports and contexts within high-performance sport, from talent development to senior elite. Now, Jamie aims to draw on his vast experience and balance it with the latest research to drive his practice, which he describes as individualised and evidence-informed, which we'll dig into later in our conversation. Jamie is super experienced, and it was really lovely talking to him, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so welcome everybody back to another episode of the Unlocking Fitness podcast. Today I have with me Jamie Taylor from Grey Matters UK. Hey, Jamie.
How you doing? Thanks for having me on.
That's okay. So today we're going to be talking about coach development, something that you're really passionate about. And how did you kind of get to be talking about coach development and interested in it in the first place?
Well, look, I suppose my journey as a coach probably sets everything up. And look, I suppose I stumbled into coaching through a career as a teacher. Really, never really particularly saw that as my future, but I always really enjoyed it. I mean, I had a really good supportive base of mentors working with me from when I was a schoolboy, being encouraged both to lead other groups as a coach, if you like, or just support other teachers. And from that point, I sort of just stumbled into becoming a teacher, then coach. And along that way, I've just developed a real passion for helping others and a real passion for coaching as a whole.
Cool.
And I've spent probably the last 5-6 years embedded in different environments working as a coach developer.
Cool. So can you tell us a little bit more about those environments and what they've been like?
Oh, well, look, I mean, I work across lots of different sports and lots of different contexts, ranging from, I suppose, some of the initial work I was doing was in Premier League football academies, working with ambitious coaches there, helping them to improve their practice, working with rugby union coaches, which is my background as a rugby coach, ranging across Olympic and Paralympic sport as well. So there's some really interesting places, some really interesting people, and lots of, and look, interesting enough, lots and lots of crossover as well. But I think the most obvious crossover being working with coaches, and a real pleasure to work with coaches who are trying to improve themselves and improve their practice.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? You know, it's always that when you look outside of what it is that you do, maybe into a completely different area, you can always pick out those one or two things that you can use in your own area of practice to kind of try out new things or develop yourself and your knowledge. Have you found that across the sports that you've worked in?
Yeah, I'd probably go even further, which is, I think it's deeper than one or two things that are transferable across sports and transferable across contexts. I suppose I'd see, let's say we break up coaching into three particular areas. We talk about the knowledge of which is what is this sport? What do I need to know in order to coach this sport? You've then got what we broadly consider perhaps understanding the person, understanding the context, of which, of course, principles say psychologically will transfer across contexts, but specific cultural milieu or the specific social elements of a session aren't necessarily going to transfer even from football to rugby. There's going to be similarities, but there's going to be big differences. Mm-hmm. I think the big area for me, the big area of transfer is in pedagogy, or science of learning and science of coaching, which so long as somebody is able to integrate those three bodies of knowledge, I think there is a massive crossover, because ultimately there are fundamental things that we can move from context to context, but how knowledge is used in one particular place and another particular place is going to be different. It's almost Well, look, Grey Matters as a brand and as a company is famous for the idea of it depends. And the idea of it depends is that knowledge depends, the application of knowledge depends on the context, the person, and the application.
Yeah, and I think that's the big key, isn't it? And unfortunately, I think that it's the application side of things is where a lot of education courses are letting the coaches down, really, because they're teaching a lot of what the coaches should be teaching, which is great for beginners, because like you said, they need to have that understanding in order to be a coach in that particular environment. But how they then apply that to different situations and the people that they have in front of them, it's kind of like passing your driving test almost, isn't it? Kind of left to it to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, and I suppose I've spun around and around in this conversation lots of times, and I was sat in a taxi with a former army officer the other week, and we were discussing the differences between developmental pathways for coaches and developmental pathways for soldiers and specifically for officers.
Mm-hmm.
And we were saying, well, look, if you're going to be an officer in the, let's say in the British Army, you're going to spend a year at Sandhurst. Before you get there, you're probably going to have a university degree. You're then going to move into the role where you're going to get told by a sergeant major what to do, when to do it. You're going to go through an apprenticeship with them. And then as you move up different ranks in the army, you're going to be subject to different developmental opportunities that are specifically designed for the challenges that you've got coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And fine, look, I'm not suggesting that developmental pathway is absolutely optimal and perfect, but it's a hell of a lot different to what most coaches experience, which,
Yeah.
And for me, this comes down to our expectations of coaches and what we consider appropriate for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And look, the reason I'm passionate about this is that coaches in particular have changed the course of my life and have given me opportunities that I wouldn't have otherwise had. But for reasons unbeknownst to me, is that it's acceptable for a coach to maybe do a weekend course, pass a safeguarding check, and there you go, you're responsible for the futures of young people or for adults in that regard. And for me, that to me, that expectation is probably the key lever that somebody at some point I really hope does pull.
So you mean that there's a lot of expectation on coaches?
No, I don't think there's anywhere near enough expectation on the quality of coaching or the standards by which coaching happens. And as a result, lots of people are inadequately prepared to do the job and to do the job really effectively at the level that if we want to help people either become high performers or engage in a lifelong pursuit and love of sport, I don't think we're meeting those outcomes based on the provision that is currently offered.
No, I agree. Yeah. So would you say that there's any differences between the aims of the coaches for like grassroots level compared to like high performance sport?
Yes, I definitely. They're very different domains,
Mm-hmm.
and I think those aims. This idea of three worlds in participation and performance. There's participation for personal well-being.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing this because I get intrinsic enjoyment from it. I get social kudos, or for health reasons. I'm taking part because for all of those good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Then participation for other reasons. For example, personally referenced excellence. I'm trying to better myself. I'm taking part in this because I really do want to get better. Or elite reference excellence, where I'm participating in this because I want to beat other people and I want to be the best in the world at it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think what's really interesting is if I turn up at, let's say a Sunday morning football match, and I can pretty much guarantee that the men or women who are playing in that game want to beat each other.
Yes.
And are probably going to be competing really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is an interesting, context for coaching to happen, because those people might not necessarily want to spend the rest of the week training really hard to develop their performance, but when they're performing, winning matters. But I might also arrive on the side of a pitch where in a younger group, perhaps, where winning might not matter as much, but competence and the development of competence is a really key marker for whether somebody carries on engaging in sport later down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's lots of similar strands, which is the coach's role is there to help somebody improve their performance. And that performance may well encourage them to continue participating for personal well-being reasons. And as a result, I think that we've just got to be careful how we go, right, well, this bit down here is just about people having fun and messing around. And this bit up here is about relentlessly pursuing high performance.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the boundaries are often more blurred than we might want to admit, particularly if we're, there's oversimplifications going on.
Yeah.
But there are very clear distinctions for me, often in the motivation of the participants over the course of time, not necessarily what happens on a Sunday morning pitch.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're just human beings at the end of the day. And as much as science likes to separate everything out, as human beings, everything is happening for us all at once. So there's so many elements, and you could probably pick out those 3 elements in each individual, in each situation, and probably every game, So it's just a fascinating conversation to me, because I think human nature and human behavior is super, super exciting as a thing to observe and develop.
Oh, completely. And that's why you go back to the idea of it depends. I think we've got to be really careful of oversimplifying and saying, well, it's all about fun here. And as a result, we've just got to give people a really nice experience and they'll keep coming back. Mm-hmm. When both, at least the literature we do have, would suggest that's probably not the case. And even then, the idea of fun is very different for different people.
Exactly.
I often give the example of my daughter, who does not enjoy tennis one little bit until she perceives herself to be reasonably competent.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, the benefits of participation almost don't come until she's developed a basic competence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you find generally that level of competence that she's accepting, or that people that you've coached before are accepting, is definitely an internal reference?
Well, I think that I wouldn't necessarily want to generalize from my daughter, but yeah. I think it very much depends on social circumstances, how people are brought up. Mm-hmm. I think that for the most part, that competence is externally referenced, okay. Particularly as children grow, particularly around the age of my daughter is 7, 8 years old. At that point, suddenly the competence of other people becomes a higher on the agenda for her, mm-hmm. as it is the case for many others. Now, how somebody sees competence, therefore, is an interesting thing. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily internally referenced all the time, mm-hmm. nor would I say it's necessarily externally referenced all the time.
Yeah. Again, like you said, it keeps going back to that. It depends, doesn't it? And I think that's kind of like the blurred lines that coaches have to deal with all the time. Like I said, the research and everything, science has to be very separated so we can test for individual things. But as human beings, we're not like that. So then it's up to the individual coach to understand maybe some of the science behind it, maybe none of it. It depends on their exposure to that kind of education, because there's an awful lot of really great coaches that haven't had any experience of reading research, and I have no interest in reading research. But yeah, it's up to us as people to, I think, just be open to the fact that we are teaching and coaching other people, and accepting that things will be different every time we see them, and individual people will be very different as well.
Yeah, completely with you. And coaching is a practical, applied thing. Mm-hmm. You certainly don't need to be, you don't need to have a PhD to be a really good coach. No. I would say that for me, you do need to have a base of knowledge, mm-hmm. to be a really good coach. Now, one of my concerns is that often some of the best coaches have gotten there by accident. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily a sustainable means of ensuring really high quality coaching for everybody. And that's where I think there's an interesting balance to be had there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. It's like the outlier high performance athlete that becomes really popular. I mean, like Dick Fosbury comes to mind, the Fosbury flop high jump thing. His style was going over backwards over the bar, and nobody was doing that at that time. And he didn't have any coaching from that. And then he developed this style that was comfortable to him, and then everybody else tried to copy it. And then all the science came in behind it, and everything followed from there. But again, it's like you said, if we're going to have outliers, there's always going to be outliers. And I think it's that having that balance between the understanding and of the sport itself, of the science, and the individuals as well is a really powerful place for a coach to be.
Yeah, completely agree. And there's some really interesting work coming out of education about research informed or evidence informed practice, which is different to evidence based practice. Evidence informed would go right, experience of the individual coach, needs of the context, and what does the best available evidence tell us. Evidence based would be right, work from the evidence base. What does the research tell us about the application of this particular thing in this particular circumstance? And that just isn't possible in sport.
No,
it's just not possible. It's not even really possible in education, which is why the idea of informed rather than based or driven comes from. Because it's easy in medicine when we say, right, we're going to compare this drug to placebo for this particular condition, and we're going to get a sample of 2,000 people or 10,000 people. You can't do that in sport. And as a result, we need to probably be a little bit more nuanced in our application.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, cool. So where do you see the future of coach development going?
Well, look, I think I would probably lean on some of the things I've just said about evidence-informed practice. I think that coach development is an interesting crossroads. And a couple of years ago, I was involved with the writing of SIMSPA standards for coach developer, which I think was a really robust, meaningful way forward for the development of coaches. And I think that within that document, it laid out, right, what's the role here? And the role of a coach developer is somebody who meets a coach in practice and supports them with the problems that they've got and help them to deepen a knowledge base, helps them to work through problems, and ideally sets themselves up for a future where there isn't going to be somebody supporting their learning and development, puts them in a position where they can do it by themselves. Now, that kind of a role is reasonably new. Though we've seen educator roles where, and I don't necessarily like this language, but it's typically the way that a coach educator or tutor is framed as somebody who stands up in front of a group, lectures, and then assesses people and ticks them off as competent. Mentors, which are people that are more experienced, that would talk through with a coach and sit down and think problems through with them. I see the role of coach development needing to go a little bit broader and really take advantage of evidence-informed practice. And the role of a coach developer requiring somebody to be able to draw on lots of different knowledge bases to really help a coach, and not necessarily. I think one of the trends that we've seen in the last 5 years is excessive influence from executive coaching. Executive coaching being a distinct field that's a little bit more, that's probably very light on pedagogy, very light on sports specific content, but very heavy on the interpersonal dimensions. So very relationship based. And as a result, I think lots of coach development practice has leaned that way, when in reality, I think the role needs to be bigger, broader, particularly if we're going to achieve the kinds of ambitions that lots of our sporting organizations talk about.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's like the new shiny object, it's whatever the trend is people are talking about right now. We kind of it's almost like we leap from one thing to the next, when really the key is just having a balance of everything. When something new comes up, it's like, okay, so how can we introduce this into what we're already doing to make it better, rather than just going, right, well, we need to ditch all of what we've been doing and just focus on this for now, because I think there's an element of that in all practice, really, isn't there?
Oh, completely. And look, say credit to an organisation like UK Sport that I think has really grabbed a hold of that idea and has led the way in in lots of ways in promoting that kind of practice and really helping coaches to get better at what they do.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff coming through the industry right now, which is really great to see. So if you had to give one big takeaway tip for coaches from this conversation, what might that be?
I don't want to be cliched, but I will be. And I'll say, unfortunately, coaching depends.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I would encourage coaches particularly to be looking less at recipes and cookbooks and looking for, right, how do I do this? How do I do that? And think more like a chef, somebody that's got to understand when to put the right ingredients in at the right time, at the right temperature, and what the effects of different temperatures, different ingredients are. And I think that, to me, is the real key towards improving yourself as a coach. And in my opinion, being a well evidence informed coach.
Cool. All right. So it's been really lovely talking to you. This conversation I could probably have for the next 4 days because it's just such a fascinating topic to me. But where can people find out about you and your organization and what you do?
So I think our website is greymattersuk.com. I also work as an assistant professor at Dublin City University and continue to be a rugby coach. I think my Twitter handle is @JTGreyMattersUK, and I'm sure you can probably find me on LinkedIn and wherever else as well.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll put all of that into the show notes so people can just click through and find you there. So thanks very much for your time today. It's been great fun.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
The Unlocking Fitness podcast is a Most Motion original hosted by me, Sarah Pitts. It's based on the Unlocking Fitness book series, which you can get from unlockingfitness.com. At the time of recording, book 1 in the series is available, with books 2 to 5 in the pipeline. You can find more Most Motion at mostmotion.com and on Facebook @Most Motion.